Infrastructure Committee meeting. It is Monday, March 24th. I am Councilmember Gamble, Chair of the Planning Committee, and
Councilmember Sean Parker, Chair of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee.
thank you all for being here. We're going to turn it over to the Planning Department that's going to give us a presentation. But before I do, I want to thank you all for being here and congratulate you on a successful tour over the county of wonderful informational sessions on the housing and infrastructure study. There were 6 greatly well-attended sessions that you held, and this is following up with more findings, research, and recommendations. So with that, I'll turn it over and let you all introduce yourselves and move forward.
Chairs Gamble and Parker, thank you so much for inviting us to be here today. You'll be hearing from Greg Claxton, who heads up our advanced planning and research team here in a moment, but I also wanted to acknowledge Lisa Milligan, Katie Camesis, Rochelle Albright, and Brett Withers. We're bringing together an interdisciplinary team to work through the housing and infrastructure study. And I'll just say, in the interest of time, very quickly, just remind everyone that this is one entry point today into a really interesting and challenging and hugely significant topic for our community, and we're happy to come back. So we're going to put a lot on the table today, no doubt leaving you with more questions, and there's always opportunities for additional work. So I just put that out there, but with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Claxton.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, council members. Greg Claxton with Nashville Planning. I'm going to present our draft preliminary findings and research on the housing and infrastructure study. As a reminder, this is in response to RS 2024. As a reminder, this, I got it.
You want to plug?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We've been having some technical difficulties, so we're making our way through. This is in response to RS 2024-288 that asked us, in coordination with other departments, to take a look at several issues related to housing and infrastructure. Broadly speaking, kind of 4 main questions were whether current regulations and code provisions negatively affect housing supply affordability and equity. What are the costs to deliver the housing products that will address Nashville's existing and long-term affordability needs? Can our current infrastructure support anticipated growth over the next 10 years? And does Metro need additional funding to ensure planned infrastructure improvements are built? We have progress on our research and approach to date. As Councilmember Gamble noted, we've wrapped up 6 community conversations across the county where we went out and mostly to get people aware of the project, thinking about the issues that we were grappling with. We were joined by representatives from NDOT, WEGO, and Metro Water, and just get them aware of the study and what was going on. Tonight, we have a snapshot of our preliminary responses to the research topics. I'll talk through housing barriers, middle housing opportunities, and infrastructure issues, and then I'll close with next steps. As a reminder, our guiding... No, I'm getting there. Yeah, you can follow along.
You'll let me?
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
As a reminder, when we think about the future of Nashville, our guiding document is Nashville Next, the county's general plan. We started working on Nashville Next coming out of the 2008 recession and 2010 flood. We were responding to the first signs of subsequent development, and so we expected to grow quickly and identified a strategy of managing growth through intensification of the urban core while protecting and preserving historic structures, rural areas, hillsides, floodplains, with modest additions of housing at the edges of neighborhoods along our centers and corridors. Those twin objectives, where to say yes to growth and where to be more cautious, are represented at a high level through our growth and preservation concept map. Nashville Next, along with November's successful transit referendum, provides a blueprint for where and how to say yes to new housing. As reflected in dozens of Metro-led plans and studies, many Nashvillians seek walkable communities where they and their children can walk to a store, a park, or a friend's house. Matching housing with transit and other resources, such as public facilities like parks and libraries and private amenities like grocery stores, creates community spaces and not just new structures. Nashville Next also recognizes cautions to growth, or where to say no. Rural subdivision regulations have had some success in matching existing suburban entitlements with rural character. Stormwater regulations have improved over time to protect life and safety within floodplains, as well as their natural character. But the county's hillside development standards, for example, should be evaluated to ensure these community-defining features are preserved. More subjectively, residents in neighborhoods throughout Nashville cherish their neighbors and the buildings that house them, and worry that changes mean their own neighborhoods are no longer for them. We see zoning as an important tool for implementing both the growth and preservation pieces of this. I presented previously in February about how growth since Nashville Next was adopted has exceeded our expectations. I'm not going to reiterate that, but just to note that overall, we've exceeded our forecast by about 10,000 residents, more than 30,000 households, and 44,000 homes. At the same time, the loss of affordability over this time suggests that growth is limited, at least in part, by an inability of housing to keep pace with demand to live in Nashville. I want to set a little bit of context that shapes a lot of the recommendations that follow by thinking about the different eras and patterns of Nashville's development over time. And so what this map shows is where curb and gutter is present throughout the county. That seems like a minor, sort of very functional, kind of boring thing, but it shapes a lot of development outcomes from readiness for infill to walkability and a lot and block structure. And so the historic urban core, mostly in the gray, has urban blocks and a stormwater system composed of curbs, gutters, and underground sewers. This is how the original historic city of Nashville was built out or retrofitted over time. But then around the 1950s, we had started a few decades of mid-century suburban development, defined by increasingly circuitous streets and a lack of sidewalks and curb and gutter infrastructure, creating kind of a donut pattern around the urban core. Then, towards the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s, we saw late suburban development that had, again, the urban sidewalk and stormwater facilities. And then we have large parts of the county that are rural, defined by their hills, and that are more costly to serve, especially for stormwater. So due to the different opportunities and constraints in these different contexts, adding housing can mean rebuilding infrastructure and sometimes remaking the pattern of development in a way that older cities like Memphis, Chicago, or Philadelphia may not require. These complications contribute to a charged housing market where adding homes is difficult and costly for developers and fraught for neighbors. And so I want to start with the first question. Do current regulations negatively affect housing supply, affordability, and equity? And so for further context in our approach, the overall current economic environment reflects multiple factors that we recognize drive higher housing costs. These include over a long term, a shift in Nashville's economy to higher wage sectors, more recently, higher cost of construction and high interest rates. Metro's land use policies are not the only driver of increased housing costs in this environment, but they are one of the drivers that Metro has control over. And so I'm going to talk through our approach for code assessment, the map assessment, and then historical context to understand implications for communities of color. I presented previously on the level of housing need that we have. I'm not going to reiterate this, but just that we take the volume of housing demand to live in Nashville over the next 10 years seriously. We want to contemplate that there may be reasons why that could be higher than our demand estimate from the Unified Housing Strategy. And then we're thinking about what we think is likely to be built over the next 10 years, given our current zoning code and current zoning map. And we are very interested throughout this process to figure out how do we close that gap to ensure that opportunities for housing are ready when people need them. And so looking at today's zoning code, to give a quick little history lesson here, it was last comprehensively updated in 1998. At that time, it was primarily suburban and auto-oriented, although there were areas in the county that had planned unit developments to reflect that there were some areas that needed a different set of standards, both before the comprehensive update and after. Since it was adopted, we've had many, many Band-Aids to fix different problems that we saw come up, many of them around housing and infill development. So these include the creation of contextual standards, mixed-use districts, a downtown code, alternate bulk and design standards, many different adjustments to parking standards, adaptive residential for housing and commercial properties, historical preservation, neighborhood conservation, contextual and two-story overlays, detached accessory dwelling unit overlays, many different urban design overlays, and specific plan zoning. In our assessment, Nashville's current zoning code allows both unexpectedly large structures that many people feel are out of character with their neighborhoods, but little flexibility in the number of units that are allowed to accommodate housing demand. And so some of the things that we have considered in looking at this is the number of overall zoning districts, 52 residential zoning districts in total, base zoning districts, 26 of which are applied to fewer than 1% of lots in the county, and that's not including NS distinctions. 9 of these are applied to no land at all. We have the very frequent use of overlays in SP zoning that indicate the base districts do not produce the form Nashvillians desire, especially for infill. We see a critical need for SPs and overlays in certain contexts, especially where we have a need to align future infrastructure considerations. But too often it is addressing just the form of new development. And then we also have a range of confusing and complex uses. DADUs, for example, have different definitions and pieces split across different parts of the code, along with a range of various requirements. Rules for duplexes within our zoning, that is zoning that allows 1 and 2 family, are also very complex, depending on when the lot was platted, how many times it's been subdivided, and how many other duplexes were in the subdivision originally. Multifamily use is just a very broad category that gives no insight or guidance into the form of the final structure. And then single family and multifamily can be confusingly identified based on whether you're talking about the zoning code, the building code, or the final use. As I've presented previously, today's zoning map, we think, is likely to fall short of our housing demand estimate over the next 10 years. That's kind of the low range of the demand estimate at 90,000 units over 10 years, the high range at 110,000 units over the next 10 years. We think we are probably going to have an anticipated build out of 70,000 units under this map. And so we anticipate a shortfall of 20 to 40,000 units. Broadly speaking, within our current zoning map, rental housing performs well, although at a high cost, because of opportunities in downtown, midtown, and along the pikes, and because rental responds well to higher density opportunities. However, we find that ownership opportunities are much more limited. For the building code, last year the state enabled jurisdictions to adopt new building code standards in 2 areas, single egress stair buildings up to 6 stories, and 3 and 4 unit buildings or plex houses in terms of their requirements for sprinklers and 2-hour fire ratings. Our assessment finds that other cities provide clear examples of ways to mitigate fire and health risk for both of these options. Generally speaking, we don't necessarily anticipate that these would add a lot of additional capacity, but in areas where they're allowed, they can make smaller lots more viable for smaller scale development. And that helps to make the building industry more responsive to changes in demand. I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about the impact of zoning and the current housing market on communities of color and provide a little bit of historical context. And so thinking, just to set the context here a little bit, we know that across different race and ethnic groups within Nashville, we see disparities by income, ownership, and home values, with white and Asian households having higher household incomes, higher ownership rates, and higher home values than Black and Hispanic households do. We think that this has a lot of different historic elements that go into it, disadvantage and discrimination in a wide range of areas. But like I said earlier, zoning is core to this study, and so we're going to talk through kind of the zoning aspect of that a little bit. We also recognize that home ownership in particular is critical for building intergenerational wealth, and that's why these disparities are so critical. We think one of the things that we see is that these disparities are likely to get worse within our current housing market. What I'm showing here is the percentage of block groups where median home sales in 2023 and 2024 were affordable at different income levels. And so, for example, in the yellow box, 100% of a median family income in 2023 in Davidson County was about $100,000 a year. The median home across all of the different block groups and neighborhoods in Nashville was under 10% of neighborhoods were affordable at this income level. So that is across about 450 block groups in Nashville, 10% of them had the median home sale in 2023 and 2024 was affordable to someone earning $100,000. If you go up to $200,000, that increases to 73%. I'm now going to show the same thing, but for median family income by race and ethnicity. And so here we see that for the median white family and the median Asian family, about a third of neighborhoods in Nashville had their typical home price affordable to them. When we look at Black and Hispanic families, that comes down to under 1% of neighborhoods in Nashville where the median home price was affordable to the typical Black and Hispanic family. These are stark disparities. We think the existing disparities are going to be made worse by these over time. And so we want to step back and provide a little bit of context for the zoning piece in history. So I'm showing two maps on the screen now. The one on the left is Nashville's first zoning code, adopted in 1933. It is a much simpler zoning code than what we have today, but it is structured fairly similarly with commercial districts, industrial districts, and residential districts marked by different levels of intensity, A to B or A through E. Within the residential districts, the yellow Residence A mark the lowest density within the zoning code, whereas the highest density, or Residence D, is shown in maroon. The map on the right is something that we are fairly unique in Nashville to be able to have. This is census results from the 1930 at the census tract level. We only have these census results because of pioneering work by sociologists Charles Johnson of Fisk and Walter Reckless of Vanderbilt, who worked with the Census Bureau to make Nashville the first southern city to have census tracts. They did this because they thought it was critical to highlight the unequal development levels and unequal access to opportunity that Black and white Nashvillians had. Similar to most cities in the US, we see an alignment of lower density zoning and homes with wealthy white neighborhoods and higher density with lower income and Black neighborhoods. This is often called exclusionary zoning and operates to maintain segregation, especially at the time racial segregation, through a non-racial mechanism, which is the cost of housing. We know planners at the time were aware of the racial implications of this map. Now on screen is a clipping from the Nashville Tennessean in February 1933, when city planning engineer Gerald Gimry was explaining the districts en route to adopting them later that year. He explained Residence A, B, and C very straightforwardly, but he explained, and I quote the Tennessean, that District D includes housing in which Negroes live. And so they were very aware of sort of the racial implications here. Now, because of the work of Dr. Johnson and Reckless at Fisk, we're able to go back and look and see what are the census results. And so what I'm showing here are majority Black tracts in blue, where all of the census tracts that had a majority Black population, adding up all of the zoning within them, and then the same thing for majority white tracts in green. And what we see is that within Residence A, these are overwhelmingly located within majority white tracts, while Residence D and Industrial A and B are overwhelmingly represented in majority Black tracts. We see this history in a range of things related to real estate and planning issues. We see it in our subdivision regulations and restrictive covenants, within guidance for mortgage lending and assessments of mortgage risk through the Federal Housing Administration and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, sort of the famous redlining maps that have been portrayed in The Color of Law. This is often kind of a part of the story of cities across the country and how they serve to maintain segregation and how they, through the mechanism of exclusionary zoning as well as others. I'm now going to roll forward and show this same analysis for our current zoning districts and our current demographics in 2024 and 2020, focusing on single-family zoning districts, 1- and 2-family zoning districts, and multifamily. And it becomes much, much more complicated. Looking at the section at the top for single-family zoning, the countywide average is the black bar. Census tracts that are majority white have less single-family zoning than the county as a whole on a percentage basis, whereas census tracts without a demographic majority or that are majority Hispanic or majority Black show a higher percentage than the county as a whole. 1 in 2 family is more split, and multifamily, again, no majority, majority Hispanic and majority Black have slightly higher percentages than majority white census tracts. This was a surprise to us. This is not kind of our usual expectation in thinking about exclusionary zoning. Many cities have reconsidered their single-family districts in part to meet housing demand and in part because of this history of exclusionary zoning. As we have from the start of this process, based on this research and for other reasons, we caution against broad brush changes because they may unintentionally have unexpected impacts to communities of color. In summary, the overall housing market, especially ownership opportunities, is not working for the typical Nashvilleian, and especially not for Nashvilleians of color and lower income households. This has its roots in our history of income and race-based restrictions, but has become much more complicated. This highlights uncertainties that could result from a one-size-fits-all approach. Staff recommends reassessing land use policies carefully in light of these findings. I'm going to pause for just a moment. I'm now going to take a look at the cost to deliver middle housing products to address Nashville's existing and long-term affordability needs. And I'm going to start by looking at past housing production trends since 2010. This is breaking out different building permit levels, and it's labeled permits. It's actually total housing, total units by single family, attached single family, which are typically townhomes, plex or accessory units, 3 to 4 units, multifamily in 5 to 50 units, and then multifamily in more than 50 units. And we see sustained production of single family and attached single family over the past 15 years, a dramatic ramp up in large apartment buildings with more than 50 units. Everything has declined over the last year or two. And then very, very modest levels of production of these middle housing types. And so these housing types we think are important for thinking about market rate affordability because they kind of strike a balance between the two ends of the spectrum where we do build. Where single family are often expensive by land because of the large lot sizes that are often required, while large apartment buildings are expensive to build because of the construction type. And so the goal of middle housing types is to find the balance between affordable construction types and efficient use of land. So to do this, we worked with a consulting team of local and national experts with expertise in creating codes that improve the design of new housing at moderate scales. We worked with them to identify 8 prototypes of middle housing. They developed test fits to see how these prototypes can fit onto typical lot sizes. And then they used the test fits to develop a standardized pro forma model for each prototype that allows us to test the economic feasibility of each of these kinds of housing in different lot configurations and in different parts of the county. So the missing scale housing prototypes that we're looking at are townhomes, house courts, townhouse courts, plex houses, which include up to 3 to 5 units, manor houses, which are, again, a house form, but allow up to maybe 6 to 10 units, low-rise courtyard apartments, multiplexes, and then low-rise flats. And the one on the bottom in particular has a pink area where we're starting to explore the opportunities for the affordability bonus program through that one. These include test lot dimensions and demonstrate how building, parking, stormwater, and open space fit together. Establishing these test fits are an important step towards developing code standards that would actually regulate how these could be applied to land. So I'm going to give you an example of one of the test fits. All of these will be included in the report that we're issuing this week. So this is prototype number 2, a house court in a suburban neighborhood context. It includes metrics for lot area, setbacks, number of units, height, building footprint, that sort of thing, and then specifies kind of how those were tested across different contexts, urban neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods, and then close to corridors or within corridors and centers. And then it also includes sort of stormwater, ISR, floor area, and average typical unit sizes within the build out. On the financial feasibility findings, in this case, the consultants checked the economic feasibility of each of these prototypes in an average condition across the county and compared it to the closest comparable standard typology that's being built in Nashville right now. And so on the ownership side, home prices were reduced with the middle housing typology by $200,000 to $344,000 per home. Attainability levels are improved, but they still exceed 230% of the area median income, though this is down from 330% of the area median income. On the rental side, monthly rents are reduced by $300 to $600 per home. This brings attainability levels down to 100% of the area median income, down from 120% of AMI. From their early work, we know that feasibility is likely to vary widely by market strength. All types are likely to be feasible in strong markets, but are unlikely to be feasible on a typical basis in weaker markets. Now, that doesn't mean we wouldn't ever see these built in weaker markets. A builder may find a unique opportunity. They may have a lower threshold for risk and return, but on sort of a standard basis, they don't perform as well in weaker markets. Now, one of the things facing us right now is there's just a lot of headwinds around this right now between cost of construction, interest rates, and a weaker rental market where rents have softened lately as all of that new supply is caught up. Our understanding is builders generally expect to pick that up in 2026, and so that could make these more feasible in future years. I know these numbers come in at a very high level, and so I want to talk a little bit about the logic of allowing even more expensive units, even if they're down a little bit, and how that helps the housing market overall. So the key idea here is filtering, which is the process by which older units become more or less expensive over time. For most of Nashville's history, older units became a little bit more affordable compared to incomes over time, but that has reversed in Nashville, like in many other cities, and these homes are filtering up and becoming more expensive. So one way to help illustrate this is this rental housing gap chart that we've worked with our housing division on for a number of years that shows the number of homes in yellow and the number of households in different income levels. And so if you start on the left-hand side, you'll see households that earn up to $22,000. This was a few years ago, or up to 30% of the area median income. We have a very large gap between the number of homes and the number of households seeking those homes. So what happens is these households who can't find a home they can afford sort of roll up to higher cost brackets and become cost burdened. And because they become cost burdened, they have to make tough choices between the rent and food or childcare and healthcare. And because of that, at a national level, at a state level, at a local level, and among the private sector, we see efforts to subsidize housing for these folks, to create subsidized, affordable units that are income restricted to make sure that the people who need these units the most are able to access them. This is the work of our housing division and the unified housing strategy. Our focus throughout most of this is on the regulations that guide where and how new development happens, which primarily affects new construction, which generally, as I've just shown, comes in at higher levels. So now I want to turn to the other large gap here, which is at more than 120% of AMI on the other end of the chart. This large gap, from a policy perspective for these households, there's not an issue. If you can afford more than what you're renting because you've moved from kind of the more than 120 to 100 to 120 or 80 to 100, you're saving money. You may be paying off student loans. You may be saving up to buy a home. It's not really a public policy issue, except as these folks look at cheaper homes, they put pressure on those units to become more expensive over time. So adding units at the more than 120% level helps take the pressure off those moderately priced units. We know that this is a lot to wrap your head around. It's one of the areas we're going to explore throughout the next month to help make clear the research basis for why this helps. But we see two ways that shifting to allow additional middle housing helps. One is that it lowers the cost of new units at the higher end. And second, it provides more of these lower cost units. Together, we think that helps take the pressure off and allow filtering to work to maintain these moderately priced units for moderate income households. I'm now going to turn to infrastructure and how we're taking a look at infrastructure's ability to support our anticipated growth over the next 10 years. This is more of a status update than findings, but one of the things we're going to review in detail is the range of challenges that are faced with our infrastructure in addressing system-level issues. We are working to develop 3 scenarios to explore different ways Nashville could grow over the next 10 years. These scenarios will allow departments to identify infrastructure constraints and alignment with current plans to help see how their proposed system-level improvements will help manage infrastructure going forward. Today in Nashville, we have 2 primary tools for delivering infrastructure improvements. First is public funding for countywide infrastructure systems. These include things like public safety, transportation, parks, and schools. The Choose How You Move referendum provides a critical source of funding for transportation improvements and reinforces Nashville Next as the organizing framework for other investments. And then private development for more neighborhood-based investments tied to the individual impacts of new development. These may include smaller water and sewer extensions, streets and streetscapes, intersection improvements, and private open space. Because of gaps between these two, there are still several structural stressors on Metro's ability to provide infrastructure. And so I'm going to talk through those in detail. First is that we have attempted in the past to use a piecemeal approach to system-level goals. This is clearest in our sidewalk regulations, which were strengthened in 2016 to guide delivery and try to expand the range of areas served by sidewalks. That was followed by a few years of kind of working with builders, community members, and council members to refine and better formulate when sidewalks are required with new development. But ultimately, courts overturned these regulations. This is something we have other areas of our different codes and processes that are still able to ensure sidewalks are delivered in some instances, but filling that gap and figuring out what is the right mechanism that's compliant with the court ruling is something that NDOT is actively working on. More broadly, we have limited options to align development with and infrastructure. The broad context is that Nashville is currently prohibited from using impact fees, despite this being a tool available to other fast-growing southern cities and to the counties surrounding us within the region. Because of this, requirements for infrastructure must be narrowly tailored to the specific impacts that are being mitigated and the ways that those are mitigated through the constitutional tests of proportionality and nexus. As we have worked to figure out how to better align kind of these individual development mechanisms with broader systems thinking, one example is a proposed street parallel to Trinity Lane from the Haynes Trinity small area plan. A very large SP came in. We worked with the developer to sort of begin putting in the parallel route, labeled on here as Hillside Cottage. But planning staff in land development identified a critical gap between the proposed road and its destination in Whites Creek Pike that we were unlikely to be able to get through an SP or a subdivision. And so worked with finance and NDOT to acquire the land. That was an initial effort to do this more, to begin thinking more strategically about this. It is something where Metro has a long way to go, but is part of the multimodal mobility master plan to try to identify where the critical connections are, where are we most in danger of losing these connections, and then provide a framework for strategic acquisitions going forward. We do have some ability to think more comprehensively about investments in particular areas. We have a number of existing tools, such as tax and increment financing through redevelopment districts or transit-oriented redevelopment districts. The work of the Industrial Development Board, business improvement districts may have some opportunity to do this as well. And then the state has created a new tool called infrastructure development districts in the last year that I think they are continuing to refine this year. Generally, we find that these existing tools are split across multiple separate authorities that make them difficult to coordinate with. And then some of the newer tools are untested but seem to have complicated limitations. All of this puts us puts the rezoning process in the spotlight as we think about kind of managing housing and managing infrastructure going forward. As I said, requirements for infrastructure must be narrowly tailored by the constitutional tests for proportionality and nexus. These limits are most severe for building permits under existing entitlements. Legislative decisions to increase entitlements allow more leeway. The dynamic between these two puts Nashville in an unusual relationship with the rezoning process as a tool to manage infrastructure impacts of redevelopment. It also means that there are reason to be cautious in areas with substantial infrastructure needs about proactively upzoning. And then finally, I want to highlight the role of public investments as well. As I mentioned, Choose How You Move represents a historic opportunity to coordinate mobility investments to implement many of the different plans and studies that have been underway over the past few years in a way that we haven't had before. Choose How You Move is rooted in Nashville Next's approach to priority transit corridors. And we think it gives, like the two of these together, give a stronger framework for other departments in their capital plans. And I'll just note that there are a range of master plans and capital planning efforts that have begun or that are about to begin, from Metro Water, NDOT planning, and we go through the multimodal mobility master plan. Parks has begun work on a plan to play update. Library has a more of a housekeeping update to their master plan. And then the fire department has a master plan that's recently been funded. Nevertheless, we see a wide gap between needs and funding. The CIB is an imperfect vessel for this, but across the 6 years within the CIB, it identifies more than $20 billion in requested investments, while the typical capital spending plan that actually allocates money is only about $500 million per year in recent years. And so I want to shift into potential recommendations. We're thinking, one process note, we're going to be briefing our Planning Commission this Thursday. And so we want to be mindful that we advise the Planning Commission and the Planning Commission makes recommendations to Council. And so what I have here are some initial staff recommendations that we are providing to the Commission, and then what our anticipated deliverables are and anticipated work plan throughout the rest of the year and beyond. And so initial staff recommendations for April include revising detached accessory dwelling unit standards to allow in R and RS districts throughout the urban services district. We think that this has kind of a modest impact on our overall ability to accommodate housing growth, but we think it's an important tool for households to be able to manage their own financial need or their own housing needs, as well as provide a little bit of context-sensitive density. We think we would recommend amending to the Planning Commission, amending the building code to allow taller single-stair buildings within the urban zoning overlay while improving safety requirements. And then we would recommend a resolution requesting development of bonus program incentives for affordable income restricted units within market rate housing. Looking ahead to June, and I will note I have several slides for June. We anticipate bringing a report on those alternate zoning scenarios with their infrastructure implications, as well as a framework for that bonus program incentives for affordable income restricted units, recommendations to the building code to improve the affordability of house scale plexes, those 3 and 4 unit buildings, and then recommendations for the long range planning process. Also, looking ahead to June, we anticipate bringing revised bulk and design standards of current districts to ensure new development is more closely matched to existing neighborhood character. We will also assess replacing the conventional base zoning districts with the alternate zoning standards that are currently in the code, with modifications in some places to better align in suburban areas. We also anticipate working over the next few months to draft 2 new design-based zoning districts to support low-rise, moderate-density residential development with more predictable designs. One of them we anticipate being a house-scale district that includes types such as townhomes, cottage courts, plex houses, and manor houses. The other we anticipate being a district appropriate for larger structures that includes all of the above, plus multiplexes and courtyard apartments. These new districts would need to be adopted and then mapped to property to take effect. Notwithstanding further work on the zoning map, as soon as these districts are added to the code, they would be available to council members, property owners, and communities through the normal rezoning process. Last, we anticipate bringing a recommended framework for zoning map changes. Generally, this will take the form of how new design-based districts can be used in alignment with the growth and preservation concept map and tied to the level of planned transit service and investment within Choose How You Move, or as identified through community engagement. The recommended framework may recognize critical places for accommodating growth, but which should wait for specific infrastructure deficiencies or further planning to be addressed. All of these recommendations for June we'll be working on throughout April, May, and June to engage the public further and gain feedback and test these different ideas out with community members and property owners to make sure we've got something that, as best we can tell, is functional. And so as we think about recommendations to bring forward in June, we're thinking of kind of 4 broad questions we're asking ourselves. Is it supported by Nashville Next? Will it be supported by infrastructure, either existing infrastructure with capacity, infrastructure provided with new development, or infrastructure aligned with planned public improvements? Will it result in design and form of new construction that better matches its context, especially within or transitioning to neighborhoods? And will it support a housing market that provides better opportunities for Nashvillians? Oh, yeah, that's the next one. After June, we propose to continue working, first beginning with a Nashville Next update. This will kick off a broader update to Nashville Next that extends into 2026, but we propose beginning with a housekeeping amendment specifically to the growth and preservation concept map. And the goal of this is to reflect the high capacity transit corridors and Choose How You Move and sort of true those up to make sure that they're completely aligned. Throughout this time and beyond the Nashville Next update, we would work with council members and their communities to identify appropriate locations for rezoning. And then we would develop a recommended zoning map along with any necessary changes to community character policies by the end of the year. Also beginning now and running over the next few years, there is additional policy work that we want to highlight that we think needs to be done. We are beginning work on a countywide ecological conservation plan, an update to the 1998 preservation plan, further work on infrastructure planning and investment, critical right-of-way needs and improved coordination in planning for new streets. We seek guidance on the use of tax increment financing and new infrastructure tools, and then working with our housing division, working with our new real estate team, and with general services, we recognize the critical value in public land. Our recommendation would be to find opportunities for these new housing districts on the zoning map by the end of the year, and then to use the following 2 years to see how implementation is going, collecting and reporting on feedback from neighbors, developers, and metro agencies on the performance of new bulk and design standards, new design-based districts, and building code amendments. Where warranted, we would plan to prepare recommendations to refine the standards. There may be further recommendations for changes to community character policies and zoning based on findings of the Multimodal Mobility Master Plan, Ecological Conservation Strategy, and the Historic Preservation Plan update. We may identify additional areas that are deficient in infrastructure that need particular attention. And then we think we see a need for reviewing planned unit developments to determine which have remaining entitlements and where it may be appropriate to transition to a base zoning when they are built out. In conclusion, as I mentioned earlier, we are updating our Planning Commission on Thursday. We'll be releasing the report with these draft preliminary findings and research on Friday. And then starting next week, we will advertise office hours where council members or members of the public can come by, talk to us one-on-one. There is a lot to digest in this presentation and in the report. And so we think a couple of weeks to just sort of let people start thinking about us, ask us questions. We'll have a few virtual opportunities. We think will help us gain feedback, see what questions people have, and will help community members understand kind of all of the work that's gone into that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is great presentation, very comprehensive, and we'll take questions from members who are here. I'll start off, and I think by Chair Parker may have a question. My only question is, will this PowerPoint presentation be available online?
Yes, Chair, we'll provide the PowerPoint as well as I think we'll link to the video on Friday with all of the other materials.
Thank you. Chair Parker.
Thank you, Chair Gamble. Thank you for the fantastic presentation. That's a ton of information to digest. I think I might just end up watching this again tomorrow. One question I had about looking at code, you mentioned the single stair, a couple of other building code changes. Have y'all been looking at stormwater regulations? I know that they have really improved in recent years, and I think we're at a really good spot with large-scale development. I feel like we have a little bit of a disparity between 1 and 2 family and kind of the smaller scale multifamily projects. So specifically like 3 and 4 unit projects up to kind of the 8 unit thing where, because of the way that we treat 1 and 2 family versus what we call multifamily, if you're building 3 units in a smaller footprint than a very large single family house on the same lot, you might trigger a full grading permit requirement and really stringent stormwater review despite having a smaller footprint than a potential single family home. So that's something that I've really been trying to get more information about and finding ways that we can improve that process. So have y'all been looking at the stormwater regs for smaller multifamily projects in specific as part of this?
Chair, yes, we have. We've got a regular coordination call with all of the departments involved with this. Stormwater does have representatives on that, and we've specifically talked with them about that gap. One of the uses of the test fits is to help think through how all of the different requirements fit together around stormwater, but also kind of setbacks, parking requirements, kind of placement of utilities and infrastructure and sidewalks in the front of the building, that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. So is that maybe we would hear more in the June period of recommendations on that? Would that be?
Yes, that would be right. It may, I want to be a little cautious here. I think Stormwater is actively taking a look at that. And so we may sort of see what the appropriate process is for that. But that is certainly top of mind for thinking about the middle density pieces as well and making sure that they come out with viable projects that are kind of appropriately scaled to their neighborhood context and deal with infrastructure appropriately.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and we'll open it up for questions, starting with Councilmember Benedict.
Thank you, chairs, and thank you, Director, and thank you, Greg. So I've got a few questions. First, on the impact fee, the fact that we're not allowed to do it. I actually heard a story, I'll be brief, but in one of our surrounding counties, when the tornado came through a couple of years ago, there was a development, a warehouse that was being built, and maybe they had something down with it. The tornado came through, knocked it down, and the city there was allowed to collect a second impact fee for that same parcel. Anyway, that's a missed opportunity that we don't get, so I just say that to call that out. But when I've talked with people in Nashville about having an impact fee, do you have an opinion about how that would be passed down? Would that be something that would increase the housing cost that a developer would pass on to the end user? Obviously, you don't necessarily have control of this, but any research on
that? Generally, impact fees would go into the price of the housing overall. I think that would generally be my expectation. We haven't looked at it in a whole lot of detail because it's not a tool that we have right now. That said, I think infrastructure mitigation does that as well, but it does so in a much more unpredictable fashion that is difficult to know in advance. What do you put into your pro forma? And so I think one opportunity with an impact fee is to sort of make that a little bit more predictable for everyone involved, and then to get all of these different pieces working together more systematically.
And I think that having lost the case on sidewalks, right, at the state, I think that the only way that we'll get that from the private sector is through an impact fee. I don't know that that's the right answer or not, but I appreciate your opinion on that. One thing I wanted to ask a little bit more, I really appreciate the slides in regards to the racial disparities. I noticed though, since 2000 on one of the maps that you had, it showed the growth in different areas of the city since after 2010, I believe it was. It might have been after 2000, but it showed that most of the growth was in Southeast Nashville and in Bordeaux and North Nashville. And not in other neighborhoods. I ask this question because District 7 has become more white over the past 10 years. So I want to understand, how we can prevent that from happening in the future. What is this something that we'll be able to have an impact to make sure we're not doing the, redlining or segregation or driving that behavior from developers in different areas of town. So even though it might not be redlining today, if we're putting high density housing in minority neighborhoods as compared to maybe middle density housing that's more affordable in neighborhoods like I have in District 7, driving the price point down, it seems to me that that would be a way that we could impact that, more of a opposite of white flight, you've got richer, whiter people living in the city generally than in the past, and we're moving minority communities to North Nashville and to Southeast and pushing them further and further out. So I guess my question to you would be, do your recommendations, or do you anticipate your recommendations will help to address that?
Yes. Broadly, we're trying to think very carefully because of that history that I presented about how the private market interacts with vulnerable communities of color who want to maintain their neighborhoods. So I think there's kind of a need to think about balancing in different parts of the county so that vulnerable communities don't get all of the investment, but also at the flip side so that they don't receive any investment, so that there's no ability to sort of build that intergenerational wealth, so that they're cut off from sort of the improvements that follow. That is a difficult balance to strike. And again, I don't think we are going to have something that exactly addresses it perfectly, but starting to make strides and starting to think of how interconnected these different pieces are is part of I think what we're trying to do with our framework and looking back at this historical pattern.
Thank you. One last question, chairs. Today, there's a neighborhood bus line that routes through District 7, but the number 4. And it was just expanded through Choose How You Move to be 24 hours a day. But it's an area that it's single family zoning for the most part. Is it better to build more housing there or remove the bus line? My guess would be to build more housing.
Don't answer that.
You don't have to answer that.
Part of what we're going to be looking at, though, is where we're making investments, and we may recommend additional housing. One of the things that has been a little vexing for us in the case where you saw us trying to piece together a new street by private and public development, right? Private and public investment is, what's the outcome? Do we have land uses there in that case or anywhere else that really support the investment that the city's made in a complete street? And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. Planning can't do it alone. We need sort of guidance and partnership with this body, as well as NDOT and WEGO, to make sure that we do have housing investments where we've made those transit lines available.
My hope would be that you build more housing to support the transit, since we just by 2/3 passed a transit plan that people support. So I hope that those recommendations will come out. Not that I'm here to guide you. The stats clearly are guiding you, which is why you've got the stats guy on the job here. But I'd like you to think about that as you move forward too. Thank you. Thank you, chairs.
Thank you. Councilmember Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 2 questions. One, it sounds like you, in the recommendations, would create sort of some new zoning districts or rearrange them to some degree. One of the things that was talked about was maybe applying form-based code to multiplexes in existing zoning so that we could say, maybe we will allow 1 quadplex on a street if it looks like the rest of the 4 squares on the street or something like that. Does that fit into what's being proposed?
I think it would. Creating these districts that are at that scale would enable that to be applied to individual properties like that. And I think kind of exploring something, but I think our focus would be exploring kind of opportunities specifically aligned around the growth and preservation concept map and Choose How You Move. But once they're in the code, they're available to use kind of as communities and council members see fit.
And just, chairs, with your permission, just to clarify for the folks viewing the presentation and discussion, the planning department is an advisory entity. So for those watching, if you hear Mr. Claxton or me talking about what we would propose to do, that requires a public process and that requires this body to act. We're advisory to council and don't make unilateral decisions. So I should have mentioned that at
Thank
the
you for
start
that
of the
clarification.
presentation.
And then just to get in the weeds for just a second, I'm excited to know about the ecological conservation plan that will be going on with part of this, and would just love to, again, throw out the big hope that the Highland Rim Forest will continue to be considered as part of that plan.
It is,
Yes.
and we want to make sure, I mean, when people hear about zoning, they often think it's about growth and development, and it's as much about the natural features of the city as, you know, other parts of the code. And so it's both and for us. Thank
Great.
you. We're looking
Thank you.
forward to working with you on it.
Good. And then similarly, just that as we continue to look at how other cities do tree ordinances and things like that, that some of the cities that we looked at as we did our tree standards also have some really robust tree protections for existing mature trees. And I would love to see us continue that work as well. And I think that fits in with this.
Thank you. Councilmember Evan Siegel.
Thank you. I'm just going to start in the weeds so that as I digest this, like not just today, but going forward, I know what I'm digesting. There were times on the slides when you were very specific about an area. If you weren't specific about an area, was it countywide for any of that data on like housing affordability and was all that countywide, or was any of it limited?
Off the top of my head, I think everything should be countywide.
That's what I thought, but I just want to make sure some of it wasn't like pulled out to USD or anything like that.
Let's clarify. In the,
Yeah.
we will, thank you for that suggestion, and we'll make sure we update it to be absolutely.
Okay. On, I think that it was audible, at least from our row, on the housing affordability slide on who can afford a house. And we saw, you know, over 30% and less than 1%. What is considered a healthy number for that? Like what, in a city that's considered affordable, what would you want that to be?
So if we're comparing medians, I would want to give that a little bit more thought. For the median family, I might say 50%. But I would want to think through kind of how that varies. I mean, you wouldn't say 200% of the median would be 200% of the county. So I would want to think carefully about that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I didn't know if there was like a planning standard, but I would be curious, like, if we're just talking about a healthy economy, what does that look like? You mentioned that there are 9 districts we don't use and 26 that are hardly used. It's sort of pulling out all the, can we just call it like junk, the stuff we don't use? Like, is cleaning that up going to be a part of the recommendations as well?
We do seek to clean that up. I think there's some things that we have, some opportunities to simplify, especially around the conventional and the alternative districts. Some of that implicates, I think, some longer term discussions for Nashville, though, in terms of the very wide variety of different zoning districts that are almost exactly the same, but with very subtle distinctions. I think some of that is a little bit longer term than what we can get into here, but we do plan to take a first crack at it.
And just to sort of, I guess, clarify for folks who might watch this, when you talk about PUDs and bringing them into the zoning code, if you go on Parcel Viewer and you just want to see everything that's zoned PUD, you know, you can see, you know, there are like 80s and 90s subdivisions, right, that go all around the county. And so are you talking about looking to see, like, if there's no formal HOA there, for example, is that something where you would look at getting rid of the PUD zoning and put in normal, like, residential zoning, for example?
I think the goal would be to, if there's a PUD that's not critical to be maintained, that's not guiding future build out, that has some correspondence to something in the zoning code otherwise that would kind of do the equivalent of the PUD, would be to bring it over into the typical zoning districts. Now, I will say, like, this is something we recognize is an issue, but it is like getting into the PUDs, like each one is very detailed and very long. and very old. And so figuring out like a way to approach it, I think will be like a serious undertaking. That's why we've kind of said we need a couple years to even figure this out. So I don't know what that looks like on the outset, the end of that process. But it's to figure out kind of how can we make these a little bit more normal rather than having this convoluted thing that's just decades out of date.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch, and anybody can go online and just see them, and they just sort of pop up all over the place. I think my last question is, you talked about the building code updates. Isn't it, I think it's also time for us to look at the building code as a whole, right? Because we're on our alternate cycles. And so how is that going to play out together or not together?
I think we've talked with Codes and Fire about the possibility of wrapping this into that next update, or maybe just getting it done as a standalone thing that with a fair amount of community interest, but then carrying that forward into it. So we recognize that that's an opportunity. I don't think we quite have a recommendation yet on the exact timing.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Vice Chair Rutherford, you recognized.
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate the whole team and the effort that went into this. My question is really sort of a follow-up to Councilmember Evan Siegel's questions, and in particular, the piece on affordability. When it comes to the numbers that were presented, do we have any data, or do you have any data that shows comparisons to other cities? And how much did that potentially play into this? And is that something that has come up when you're engaging with the community on this as well? Because I know we often tend to live in a silo and not think of ourselves in terms of comparison to other cities, but also a breakdown, if you will, between Nashville and other cities, but also other metros as well. And so it would be interesting to see kind of how we compare, because there's certainly, we have work to do, but can we compare ourselves to other cities and say, look, we should be like this, or we don't want to go in that direction or this direction? So if you could address that, I'd appreciate it.
It's something we've looked at from time to time in the past, not quite in that structure, because that's using assessors data, which we don't have access to from other cities. But it's something we can work on either towards Friday or kind of in the coming months and the final report, look to provide some comparison points.
Thank you. Chair Parker.
I have a couple of quick questions. One, so we had, one of them got moved out of District 5 in the last redistricting, but we've had a few mobile home parks. And I've looked around the zoning map at mobile home parks, and I've never found one that's zoned mobile home park. Is mobile home park one of those zonings that is not utilized anywhere in the county?
I don't know that off the top of my head. I don't know that it was one that I looked at in my count, but do you want to?
Hi, everyone. So that is a district that is not currently used, and most of the existing mobile home parks actually predate the creation of that district. And so that most of them are typically non-conforming uses in that they existed before the creation of the district that sort of permits them. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful context. And then my other question was about the DADU recommendations. Y'all mentioned the Urban Services District. I guess I can see kind of why we're looking at Urban Services District, but what about the General Services District? There might be some communities there that very specifically would think these are appropriate for their area. Would the overlay still be applicable in, could we make the overlay applicable in GSD areas that folks feel it's appropriate to have that option? I guess what are y'all thinking about that?
I can speak to.
Introduce yourself, I'm sorry.
Sure. Lisa Milligan. Sorry, I didn't do that before. I can speak to the overlay is not currently available within the GSD. I'll let Greg speak to sort of other changes that we might be proposing, but I did just want to say that right now, as it stands, it's not an option within GSD.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I was getting a note. Is that the data overlay itself? Okay. I mean, I think that's something we could contemplate as we look at making this change.
I mean, the department's posture is we want it to become more available. And so we're very interested in hearing from this body as well as to what constraints and opportunities, depending on the context, would help it be a more easily used tool. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And I don't represent any general service area, but I think you might find from community to community, there might be widely varying opinions about that as an option. So I would definitely recommend engaging with our GSD council members and their communities about the data question specifically. Not to hold up the USD idea, but just in addition to that.
Thank you, Chair Parker. And speaking as a district council member that has GSD residents who are very interested in the DADU overlay expansion, thank you. I concur with your sentiment there. We definitely need to include that.
But that's all I've got for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, go, yes.
Well,
yes.
I wanted to see, I was reminded by a colleague that my answer to Councilmember Rutherford was incomplete. I wondered if I could follow up on that.
Yes, please.
I had forgotten that particular analysis is one that of comparing recent home sales by the different block groups or neighborhoods in Nashville to different income levels is one that we reran, but it originated with a consulting team that did a market value analysis for Nashville. While we don't have numbers for other cities in that, they did provide us their sense of our market when they were doing this. They're a firm, the Reinvestment Fund, that's done 40 of these market value assessments across the country in a variety of different markets. They were working on this in 2023, I believe. And they noted they have never seen a market like Nashville's. They noted that there are, like every other area that they work in, there are neighborhoods that are very strong markets. They have neighborhoods that are weak, where the cost of home repairs is not going to be like supported by the value of the investment. Like they're so disinvested that keeping up with homes doesn't make financial sense. And so they're used to seeing like a wide variety of markets like that within an area that they're studying. They did not find any neighborhoods like that in Nashville. That doesn't mean that everyone who owns a home in Nashville or who rents is able to afford the cost of maintenance. But from a market perspective, like the market is strong enough in basically every part of Nashville to support ongoing investment. And so it is something that makes us a little bit unique. I don't know that it will show up in the affordability numbers in quite that way, but it was something that was very striking to us. And I pressed because I've mostly seen their work in Baltimore and like Akron, Ohio, and kind of struggling markets. But they had recently worked with Houston. They were doing Jacksonville, Florida at the same time. And so they were looking at kind of other booming southern cities.
Vice Chair Rutherford.
Thank you for that. Does that mean, in essence, that that we're unique enough that we can't really be compared to other cities? Is that what you're saying?
I would always say that, but I think from a data perspective, I think there are definitely useful things to look to other cities for and see how we're performing and sort of testing out, like to the two questions, like how typical is that, and then seeing like what would it mean to if it's typical. I think that gives all cities, I think, a lot to think about. If we're atypical in sort of how unaffordable we are, I think it really reinforces the need to think a little bit differently.
And then you were referencing the data that the consultants were using. Is that data available to us?
It is just recent sales from the assessor's office. So, I mean, it's something we'll provide in more detail in the report. But if there are particular questions, we can pluck that out and provide it in some way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Horton. Oh, there we go. There.
Thank you very much. And thank you to planning for being here. This is a really incredible and very exciting preliminary findings. I appreciate the conversation around the interaction of supply and demand and how the filtering phenomenon works with the negative correlation of supply and cost. I was wondering if I could try to summarize it very, very succinctly. If it would be fair to say that building more housing lowers costs, and we can lower costs even more if we not just build more housing, but build different types of housing, particularly the missing middle housing typologies that you touched on. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I would have one little corrective to say building housing lowers costs relative to what they would be without it. I mean, I will say, like from someone who believes deeply in the importance of supply and demand, like the last 10 years in Nashville have been very challenging for that. I mean, we've had a huge demand shift, first around 2014, 2015, and then again in 2020 and 2021. And it's really stark, like how much we've been able to build, especially compared to some cities that, with that have become more expensive. And yet we are still, we still see much higher much lower attainability for both ownership and rental opportunities.
Thank you. I do have a comment if we don't have any more questions. Okay. Councilmember Benedict.
Thank you, Chair. So could you speak about the state enabling legislation? I believe I've heard that Knox, Murray maybe, Columbia area and Shelby have used at least one of those new tools that the state has given us. Is that right? Or can you name what counties or, around the state have used them? Putting you on the spot about a lot of data.
Are you for single stair, it's Knoxville, Jackson, Tennessee, and Memphis just passed single stair and 3 and 4 family. I'm not aware about the 3 and 4 family in those other 2 jurisdictions, but those are the jurisdictions that have started to use that enabling language.
And thank you. And is there any enabling legislation in those areas relative to the affordability bonus is what I'm going to say?
No, not in those jurisdictions.
Councilmember, I believe Chattanooga is working on that, but I don't know the current status.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember. And I just wanted to note that I appreciate this approach that you all are taking and doing this study and looking and considering all stakeholder questions and concerns. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that during the community sessions, I attended 3 of them, and I will say at the Green Hills session, the community was very concerned about property rights. So the way that your approach in looking at new districts, adding new districts as opposed to a broad revamping of the current zoning, I think is responsive to those concerns that we heard there. And also at the Bordeaux meeting, that community was really concerned about concentration of subsidized housing, low-income housing in that area, and to hear that you all are really taking a deep dive and consideration of gentrification in areas and making sure that any rezoning doesn't exacerbate that or imply or implicate that even more in our historically minority neighborhoods is great to hear. So I wanted to say that for the public, that you all are being responsive to some of the community concerns that we've heard, as well as other stakeholders, and really appreciate that. You all have any closing remarks? Just to reiterate the next steps.
I just want to acknowledge the work of Mr. Claxton and the team. He has done so much to get us to this point, and we're still, sort of at an early-ish entry point here. We've got preliminary recommendations in front of you, and I want to thank all of you. I mean, council, this body is responsible for the zoning in the city. We want to provide you with good advice, and I trust you to tell me if there are things that we need to be bringing forward that will help you as a body be productive. We want to do it. And also, lastly, to that point, Chair Gamble, we're really interested in making sure, given the scope of this, that we're having the right conversations with our neighborhoods, as well as leadership in various communities. And what does that look like? We want to make sure that we're being successful. Don't believe in just sort of a top-down planning approach. I think you'll know So to do that well, though, is hard. And so I want to get that feedback, and I just thank you so much, chairs, for having us here today. Do you want to talk about next steps one more time, Greg?
Happy to. So we'll be at Planning Commission on Thursday, giving them a similar update as tonight. We'll be posting the draft preliminary findings and research, this PowerPoint, linking to the presentation from our website at engage.nashville.gov/housing and infrastructure on Friday morning. And then we'll be posting this week to the website, kind of office hours that people can drop by or join us virtually for the public and council members who may have additional detailed questions or just trying to figure out, hey, there's a lot in here. What does this all mean? We know it's a lot. We're gonna try to work with everybody we can.
Thank you so much. We are adjourned.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.